I was never the type to jump from church to church or to invent new trends with my faith. Since my early 20s, I had remained steadfast in the same denomination, following everything by the book. I prayed, fasted, read the Bible, attended services, and above all, I delivered my tithe with rigor. I truly believed that this put me in a special place before God. I was even proud to say that in over 20 years, I had never failed to tithe. To me, that was proof of my faithfulness. Whenever something good happened in my life, I would quickly associate it with my faithfulness in my commitments to God. I saw no problem with that. It was what I had learned from an early age. You give, and God gives back. But honestly, I lived that faith more as a transactional logic than out of true love. And I didn't even realize it. Life was going normally until that Saturday. I had just left a church event and was driving home. It was almost 10 at night. It was raining heavily, and I don't even like driving in the rain, but I insisted because the next day there was Bible school. I only remember seeing the headlights of a truck coming the wrong way, and shortly after, an impact so strong it felt as if my body left me. It was strange because, at the same time, I felt the shock. I saw myself outside the car as if I were hovering over the scene. I saw my body strapped in the driver's seat, blood on my face, and the car destroyed. I wasn't in pain. In fact, it was as if I had become a spectator to it all. I felt an absurd peace, but also a different kind of fear, a fear of realizing that I was no longer in control. After a few seconds, or maybe minutes, I don't know, that vision of the accident began to fade, and everything turned white. A white so intense that I couldn't see anything, yet at the same time, it didn't hurt my eyes. It was as if I were floating inside a living light, which carried both weight and lightness simultaneously. It wasn't just visual, it was a feeling. I felt completely exposed, as if everything inside me were being scanned, even thoughts I had never shared with anyone. And that's when something happened. From the midst of that light, a presence emerged that made me crumble inside. I didn't see a face in the way we're used to, but I knew with every part of my being that it was Jesus. It wasn't a guess, it was absolute certainty. His presence was so strong that it made me feel ashamed of myself, as if all my years of faithfulness were suddenly insignificant before him. And the craziest part was that even realizing that, I felt completely loved. It was a mix of embarrassment and acceptance, as if he were showing me who I really was without condemning me. He didn't shout, didn't point a finger, didn't preach. He simply looked at me, or perhaps penetrated me with that gaze that seemed to see through everything. And without uttering a single audible word, he began to show me things about my life. I saw scenes of myself inside the church, raising my hands during services, handing over tithe envelopes with conviction, correcting brothers for disobedience, giving advice based on the Bible. Yet, along with these scenes, I felt something very strange. It was as if he were making me feel the true motivation of my heart at those moments, and that broke me. I realized that much of what I did was more out of fear of losing the blessing or wanting to appear spiritual rather than out of genuine love for God. It was a painful feeling, as if I were seeing my religion stripped bare without makeup. And Jesus, with that serene and firm gaze, made me understand that he never wanted my tithe as a transaction, but rather my surrendered heart, and that, no matter how beautiful my effort might have seemed, it was truly empty. At that moment, something inside me began to crumble. It was as if all the certainties I carried about my salvation, about being right with God, had been ripped away in an instant. I realized that for years I had treated God like a kind of boss, where I delivered the tithe as payment and expected benefits in return. It was a relationship based on a contract, not on love. And the worst part is that I truly thought I was pleasing God. Seeing that, Laid out before Jesus in that way was like taking a punch in the stomach of my soul. And yet, I felt a peace that made no sense, a presence that enveloped me as if to say, "Now that you have seen, you can start over." It was at that moment that he took me, not by walking, but as if my consciousness moved along with him to a place that seemed like another realm. The light gradually diminished and the atmosphere grew heavier, denser. I felt the air was different, a sensation of God's absence. And then I knew he was showing me something that awaited those who live only by appearances. I didn't see fire, demons, or those horror movie scenes we imagine, but I felt a pain I had never felt before in my life. It was as if all the people there were in a state of absolute separation, a loneliness that hurt more than any burn. It was the kind of place where God's presence no longer existed, and that in itself was the worst possible punishment. Some figures seemed to wander aimlessly, their faces distorted by repentance, as if trapped in an eternal loop of memories of what they had failed to live. And I understood, without anyone explaining it to me, that those people were not there because they had committed scandalous sins, but because they had never had a true relationship with God. They had lived a faith based on rules, rituals, and empty religiosity, just like mine. I began to cry, but it wasn't a physical cry. It was deeper, as if my soul were screaming for mercy. And even there, in the midst of that despairing environment, I felt that Jesus was still with me, as if he was showing me all of that, not to condemn me, but to warn me. It was a warning, not a sentence. After such an intense experience, Jesus led me back to the light. The transition was as quick as it was strange. In 1 second, I was in that environment of pain and absence, and in the next, I found myself enveloped once again by that indescribable light. But now, something in me had changed. I no longer felt like just a shocked religious person, but like someone who had finally understood what God always wanted from me. That's when he showed me another place, which I believe was a representation of heaven. There were no streets of gold or shining gates, but there was a peace so powerful and a love so pure that it was almost hard to breathe. People were there, but the focus wasn't on them. It was on God's presence in everything. That place didn't require effort to be accepted. It wasn't a prize for good behavior. It was the home of those who had truly surrendered. There, everything revolved around love, grace, and surrender. And at that moment, Jesus looked at me again, and even without uttering a single word, I understood. I was being given a chance to return and live differently. When I realized what that meant, my heart raced. I thought, how can I go back? Part of me wanted to stay there, in that peace, far from all the burdens of life. But another part knew that it wasn't my time yet. Jesus didn't send me back with promises of blessings or grand revelations. He only gave me a feeling, live the truth. And I understood that this meant abandoning everything that was performance and living a faith that is born out of love, not fear. Before I knew it, I started to hear confused voices, metallic noises, a constant beep, and I opened my eyes. I was in the hospital, surrounded by machines, with my wife crying by my side. Later, I learned that I had been given almost no chance, but there I was, alive, different. It seemed as if I had been born again, but it wasn't a fleeting emotion. It was a clarity, as if I had finally seen what had always been right in front of me, but I had never truly taken the time to see. After being discharged, nothing seemed to fit into my old way of living. The memorized prayers, the services where I cared more about what others were doing than about myself, the meetings where the focus was on how much each person had put in the envelope, all of that began to lose meaning for me. And that doesn't mean I left the church, but rather that I stopped living for the sake of the structure. The first thing I did was talk to my pastor. I tried to tell him what I had experienced, but I noticed that he became uncomfortable. He listened, but with that look of someone trying to find a polite way to disagree. When I said that I understood that the tithe should not be a bargaining chip, he cut me off and said I was confused because of trauma. I realized then that not everyone was going to accept what I had experienced. And that's okay. That experience was for me. It was as if God had taken me off the production line to show me what really matters. I began to change, but it was from the inside out. And perhaps that was the hardest part, because no one sees what's happening on the inside. People expected me to be the same faithful tithe brother. But now I no longer cared about appearing a certain way. I started helping people anonymously, listening more and talking less, understanding that generosity goes far beyond an envelope handed over at the altar. I began to serve out of love, not obligation. And over time, God placed in my path people who were also tired of a mechanical faith. I didn't go out preaching in public squares or trying to convince anyone. But little by little, people began to approach me to understand why I had changed so much, and I would tell them, without embellishment, what I had experienced. Some people were moved, others fell silent, and some even drifted away. But I knew I was on the right path, because for the first time, I wasn't doing anything to feel saved. I did it because I loved. One of the things that most struck me after the experience was realizing how religion can become a hiding place. For years, I used my faithfulness as a kind of shield to avoid dealing with the empty parts of my heart. It was easier to follow rules than to face the fact that I didn't truly trust God. I was afraid of losing everything, afraid of not being blessed, afraid of being forgotten by Him. And the tithe to me was almost like spiritual insurance. Only after that experience did I understand that God doesn't want to be bought with good deeds. He wants to be known. And knowing someone requires time, sincerity, and surrender. There's no way to maintain a true relationship with God if you only approach Him when you want something in return. Today, I see that with such clarity. But at that time, it felt like I was giving up everything I believed was right. It was a painful process to let go of my religious masks, but it was necessary, because deep down, I realized that I had never fully trusted in God's love. I only obeyed while expecting a reward. The people around me started to notice my new attitude. Some said I was cooling off in my faith. Others thought I had strayed just because I stopped talking so much and started listening more. I stopped demanding from others what I myself no longer lived out sincerely. This naturally caused some religious friendships to drift apart, but it brought me closer to others who were thirsty for something real. And the most surprising thing is that in all this process, I began to feel a new peace. It wasn't the peace of someone who thinks they are doing everything right, but the peace of someone who knows that, even being imperfect, they are truly loved by God. That constant fear of making mistakes and being punished was gone. Instead, I began to seek to please God because I wanted to, not because I was afraid. My way of giving, of serving, of relating to people changed completely. And it all started with that encounter that turned my life upside down, but this time for the right reason. Over time, my relationship with the tithe also changed completely. I continued to contribute, but now with a light heart. It was no longer that suffocating commitment that made me look at my bank statement in fear of stealing from God if I had 1 cent extra. Now I gave because I trusted. And more than that, I began to realize that money was only a minimal part of what God wanted from me. I started to donate my time, my listening, my attention. Things that I once thought were less spiritual. I began to see Jesus in places where before I only saw rules. A silly example. I had a neighbor who always annoyed me, a grumpy old man who complained about everything. Before, I would only pray for him and avoid contact. After my experience, I began to go to him, talk, bring him bread, ask how he was doing. At first, he was puzzled, but later he began to wait for me. And in those small things, I felt God's presence more than in many emotionally charged services. It was as if I had exchanged religiosity for the living gospel. One of the strongest experiences after the NDE occurred during a regular service, months after everything had happened. The pastor was talking about faithfulness to God and mentioned the tithe, as always. But that day, a simple lady at the back raised her hand and asked to give a testimony. She recounted that, even without financial means, she felt in her heart to take a food basket to another sister in the church who was in need. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but it was clear that it was sincere. In the end, she said, "I don't have much money to put in the envelope, but this week I gave my love." That disassembled me. I understood in her simplicity everything that Jesus had shown me that day out of my body. God does not measure values in money. He measures surrendered hearts. And at that moment, I knew that the living faith had found a place there. Even if many were still trapped in rituals, God always finds a way to touch those who are willing to love truly. After that service, I went home thinking about how patient God is with us. For years, He tried to reach me in various ways, but I was so fixated on the idea that my obedience was enough that I didn't even notice. Sometimes we think we're doing everything right, but in reality, we're just hiding behind discipline. It took nearly dying, literally, for me to understand that heaven isn't a place for those who complete tasks, but for those who love genuinely, love that is expressed in actions, in compassion, in sincere surrender, and that applies to everything: family, friends, strangers. Today, when someone asks me how I changed, I say that it wasn't me who changed. It was Jesus who showed me who I really was, and that turned everything upside down. And even though I return to the same routine, same house, same church, I am no longer the same. Because now I see what I used to just repeat. Sometimes I still catch myself remembering the light, His presence, that silence full of meaning, that love that doesn't judge but transforms. There isn't a single day that goes by without me thinking about what I experienced. And no matter how hard I try, I will never be able to put into words what that encounter was. It was as real as this chair I'm sitting in now, but it was also so beyond our human understanding that it seems like a dream. But it wasn't. It was the most real thing that ever happened to me. And even today, I don't know why God gave me that second chance. Maybe out of mercy, maybe because He knew that somehow I was going to tell this story, and that's what I do whenever I can. Not to convince anyone, but to remind them that what He wants from us are not sacrifices or promises, but available hearts. If anyone reading this is living trapped in a heavy faith, full of fear and demands, know, there is something much greater waiting for you. I saw it, and that changed everything. Today, my mission is simple: to live what I experienced. I no longer try to prove anything to anyone, nor do I worry if my faith seems intense enough for others. I just want to be true to what Jesus showed me. There are days when I fail, of course. There are moments when the old mentality tries to come back, that voice that says if I don't do everything right, God will punish me. But then I breathe, close my eyes, and remember that light, that peace, that gaze that pierced me without crushing me, and everything falls back into place. I no longer live out of fear, but out of gratitude, and honestly, that makes everything I do now, including tithing, taste different. It's no longer a transaction. It's an offering of love. Not because I want to buy something from God, but because now I understand that He has already given me everything, the chance to start over. And that's it. I can't explain why it happened to me, nor do I expect everyone to believe it. There are people who hear it and say it was just a brain delirium, a coma thing. That's fine. I don't want to convince anyone. I only know what I lived. And since that day, I have never been the same. Life went back to normal, yes, work, bills, commitments, routine. But something inside remained different, as if a part of me had stayed there, in that light. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, I still feel that presence. Not all the time, but enough to remind me that it wasn't imagination. It was real. Real like the love of a God who doesn't want perfection or performance, only truth. And if you've read this far, maybe it's because he also wants to remind you of that today.